My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 7:14 on a Wednesday night. Not a call, a message through the school's parent communication app, the kind teachers use to send homework reminders and field trip notices. Nolan had figured out that it was the one channel his mother didn't check. 3 words. "Grandpa, please come." I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone for a long moment. Then I turned off the stove, grabbed my coat, and walked out to the truck. My name is Gerald Harmon. I'm 58 years old. I spent 30 years in construction, mostly commercial builds in the Pittsburgh area, until a back injury forced me into early retirement. I live alone now in a house that used to feel full. My wife Norma passed 8 months ago, pancreatic cancer, fast and cruel. She was here in April and gone by June, and the house has been quieter than I know what to do with ever since. Nolan is my grandson. He's 16 years old, and he's the kind of kid Norma always said was going to be something. Smart, careful, thinks before he opens his mouth. He used to spend summers with us when he was younger. Norma taught him to bake bread, and I taught him to fish. Those were good years. When my daughter Carol married Clifford Tate 3 years ago, things changed, not all at once. Slowly, the way water finds its way into a foundation crack. At first, it was just that visits got harder to schedule. Then the phone calls got shorter. Then Nolan stopped calling at all, and when I asked Carol about it, she'd say he was busy, that teenagers were like that I was reading too much into it. 6 months ago, Carol called me about a loan. She and Clifford wanted to refinance the house and needed a co-signer. I looked at the numbers and told her I couldn't do it, not because I didn't want to help her, but because the debt ratio didn't make sense and I wasn't going to put my name on something that could go sideways. She was quiet on the phone for a few seconds. Then she said she understood. But after that, she was harder to reach. And when I did get through, the conversations were short and careful, like she was watching what she said. I didn't put all of it together until Thanksgiving Day. The drive from my place to Carol's house in Pittsburgh normally takes about an hour and 40 minutes. In the snow that Wednesday night, and then again on Thursday morning when I left early, it took closer to 2.5 hours. I had the radio on low, and I tried not to think too hard about why a 16-year-old boy would send his grandfather 3 words through a school messaging app instead of just calling. I turned onto their street around 3:10 in the afternoon. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that only happens on holidays. Everyone inside, every house putting out light and smoke and the smell of food. Carol's place was at the end of the block, a 2-story with white trim and a wreath on the door. There were lights on in every window. It looked fine. It looked like everything was fine. Then I saw Nolan. He was sitting on the front steps. No coat, no hat. Just a thin gray t-shirt and a pair of jeans, both already damp from the snow that had been falling since morning. His arms were wrapped around his knees and his whole body was shaking. His lips had gone blue. I pulled the truck to the curb and got out. The cold came at me hard, but I barely registered it. I crossed the yard fast and crouched down in front of him. Nolan. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face is not something I'm going to forget. It was relief, but the desperate kind. The kind that only shows up when someone has been waiting a long time and stopped believing anyone was actually going to come. I got my coat around his shoulders and walked him to the truck. Got the heat running full blast. He pressed his hands flat against the vents and didn't say anything for a little while, just breathed. "How long have you been out here?" I asked. "Since about 11 this morning. It was 3:15. That was over 4 hours in weather that was sitting at 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Tell me what happened." He looked at his hands. "Last week I used the school app to message you. I just wanted to ask about something, about whether I should try to apply early to any engineering programs." "Mom found out," he paused. "Clifford said I went behind their backs, that I was trying to go around them and undermine how they run the house. He told Mom I needed to sit outside and think about what I'd done until I was ready to apologize. I kept my hands on the steering wheel so I wouldn't do anything I'd regret right away. And your mother agreed to this." Nolan didn't answer for a second. She didn't stop it. Through the windshield I could see the warm light in the living room window. I could make out movement inside. People sitting at a table. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. I didn't call Carol. I dialed 901. I told the dispatcher exactly what I was looking at. A minor, 16 years old, had been left outside in 5-degree Fahrenheit weather for over 4 hours as a form of punishment. He was showing visible signs of cold exposure. Blue lips, uncontrolled shaking, couldn't grip anything with his hands. I gave them the address. I told them I was the boy's grandfather, that I was with him in my truck with the heat running, and that I was not going to enter the house. Then I put the phone down and sat with Nolan while we waited. I asked him to talk to me, not about what happened that day, about everything else, about the last 3 years. It came out slowly at first, the way these things do when someone has been holding them in long enough that they're not even sure where to start. He told me it began small, the way Clifford ran the house, Chores had to be done a specific way, and if they weren't right, Nolan did them again. That part alone wasn't so unusual, but then it got bigger. Last winter, Clifford locked him out of the house for an entire night because he forgot to shovel the driveway before dinner. Nolan slept in the garage with a moving blanket. He was 15 years old. It was February. There was a period of about 6 weeks where Clifford decided Nolan wasn't allowed to eat dinner with the family. He'd said Nolan had been disrespectful and needed to earn his way back to the table. Nolan ate cereal in his room every night for 6 weeks while the rest of them sat at the table together. There were rules about when he could use the bathroom after 9 p.m. Rules about when he was allowed to speak during meals, rules about which parts of the house he could be in and when, and every time Nolan told his mother about any of it, Carol said the same thing, that Clifford was just trying to teach him structure, that Nolan needed to learn how a real household operated, that he was being too sensitive. Did she ever push back on him, I asked. Even once? Nolan thought about it. One time, early on, maybe a year after they got married. I don't know what she said to him, but I heard them arguing at night. The next morning, Clifford was fine, like nothing happened, but Mom was quiet for about a week after that. The careful kind of quiet. He looked out the window. She never pushed back again after that. I thought about the loan conversation from 6 months ago. I thought about how Carol had sounded on the phone in the months after, careful and short, like she was measuring her words. I'd assumed she was just upset with me about the money. Now I was starting to think it was something else, that Clifford had found a way to use my refusal as a reason to pull her further in and cut one more cord. I remembered something else. The previous July, I'd taken Nolan fishing at the lake for a weekend. He'd had a bruise on his forearm, dark and long, pressed in tight like fingers. He'd said he walked into a metal shelf in the garage. I didn't push it because I didn't want to embarrass him. I told myself it was probably nothing. I pulled up the photos on my phone that I'd taken when I first reached him. The timestamp was there, 3:11 p.m. His shirt damp, his lips still carrying that blue tone even though the heat had been running for 20 minutes. I photographed the school app message too, the one with his 3 words and the date stamp from Wednesday night. Then I texted Bo Whitfield. Bo is a retired guy who lives 2 doors down from Carol's place. I'd met him at a neighborhood cookout a couple summers ago when I was visiting. Good man, sharp, the kind of neighbor who notices things. I asked him if he had seen anything unusual at Carol's house that morning. He wrote back in about 4 minutes, said he'd seen the boy sitting on the front steps when he went out to get his paper around 11:30 a.m., figured it was just a teenager thing, getting some air. But he'd noticed Nolan was still there when he walked his dog at 1 p.m., and again when he brought in his trash cans around 2:30. He said he'd almost gone over to say something. I asked him if he'd be willing to write down what he saw and when. He said yes without hesitating. The patrol cars pulled up at 3:28, 2 officers. I met them at the curb and I was calm. I did not raise my voice. I showed them the photos, the timestamps, the message Nolan had sent me. I told them I also had a neighbor who had observed the boy outside at 11:30, at 1:02, and at 2:30. I told them this was not an isolated incident and that I had information suggesting a pattern going back 3 years. One officer looked at the photos and then looked at Nolan through the truck window. "How's he doing?" he asked. "Better than he was," I said, "but you should talk to him yourself." They approached the truck first, spoke to Nolan for a few minutes, then walked to the front door and knocked. Carol answered, looking completely composed. Clifford appeared just behind her shoulder. When Carol's eyes found me standing by the patrol car, something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. More like the specific look of someone who has just realized the thing they thought was contained is not contained anymore. The officers went inside. I stayed with my truck and my grandson and waited. Nolan and I sat in the truck for about 25 minutes. He'd stopped shaking by then. The color had come back to his face. He drank the coffee from my thermos, both hands wrapped around it, and we didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say right then. Sometimes you just sit with someone and that's the thing they need most. At one point I heard voices rise inside the house. Clifford's mostly. I recognized the pitch of it even through the walls, the particular tone of a man who is used to being the loudest person in the room and is now finding that it isn't working. Then it went quiet again. One of the officers came back out after about 20 minutes and asked Nolan to come inside and speak with them separately. I walked him to the door. He stopped at the threshold and looked at me. "Tell them everything," I said. "Don't leave anything out. Not the garage, not the dinner thing, none of it." He nodded and went in. I stayed on the porch. Through the front window I could see the dining room. The table was still set from the meal they'd been eating when the officers knocked. Turkey, candles, the good plates. Clifford was standing with his arms crossed near the hallway. Carol was sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her, staring at the tablecloth. She looked like a woman trying very hard to hold a specific expression and not quite managing it. The second officer came out and stood with me on the porch. "Your grandson is talking to my partner," he said. "Can you walk me through what you observed when you arrived?" I walked him through it. The time I pulled up, where Nolan was sitting, what he was wearing, his condition. I showed him the photos again on my phone. The timestamp's clear. I showed him Bo's text and explained that my neighbor had seen Nolan outside at 3 separate points during the day starting at 11:30 in the morning. The officer wrote everything down without comment. Then he asked me how long this kind of treatment had been going on. I told him what Nolan had told me. The garage in February, the 6 weeks of eating alone in his room. The rules about speaking and moving around the house. I told him about the bruise on Nolan's arm that I'd seen at the lake in July and hadn't pressed hard enough on. "Has your daughter been aware of these incidents?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "According to Nolan, she's been present for most of them." He wrote that down too. After another 10 minutes, the first officer came out with Nolan. They spoke to me briefly together. Child Protective Services was being contacted. A caseworker would reach out within 24 hours to schedule a formal assessment. Clifford had been issued a formal warning. The officers made clear that further incidents of this nature could result in criminal charges under Pennsylvania child endangerment statutes. Then Carol came to the doorway. She had her arms wrapped around herself, and she was trying to look composed, but her eyes were red and her jaw was tight. Clifford appeared behind her and put a hand on her shoulder, and she stiffened slightly at the touch, just for a second, just enough that I noticed it. "Dad," she said, "can we please just talk about this as a family privately? We're going to talk," I told her, "but not today. You don't understand what it's been like. Nolan has been difficult. Clifford has been trying to help him, and Nolan fights it every step of the way. I've been stuck in the middle of this for 3 years. I looked at her for a moment. This was my daughter. I had taught her to ride a bike in the driveway of our old house on Clement Street. I had sat in the front row at her college graduation. I had held her hand in the hospital waiting room the night Nolan was born. I know who she was before all of this. Carol," I said, "your son sent me 3 words through a school messaging app because it was the only way to reach me that Clifford didn't control. He sat outside in 5-degree weather for over 4 hours because he was afraid of what would happen if he walked back through that door. That's not difficult. That's a kid who needed help and didn't know where else to turn." She looked down at the step. "Nolan is coming home with me tonight," I said. "You can call me tomorrow." Clifford stepped forward then. His voice dropped into that low, controlled register. "You have no legal right to take him anywhere. He's a minor in my household, and if you put him in that truck, I'll have you charged with interference." I turned to the officer who was still standing nearby. He met my eyes and gave a small shake of his head. Clifford had no ground there, and he knew it. Nolan had already moved to stand beside me. "Go get what you need," I told him. "Whatever matters to you, we're not coming back for anything." He went inside. He was back in 11 minutes with a duffel bag and his school backpack. He walked past Clifford without looking at him. He paused for just a second in front of Carol. She reached out and touched his arm. He let her. Then he walked to the truck and got in. I followed him. I didn't look back at the house. The drive home was quiet for the first 20 minutes. Snow was still coming down and I kept both hands on the wheel. Nolan had the seat reclined slightly and was staring at the ceiling of the cab. I didn't push him to talk. He'd talked enough for one day. We stopped at a diner about 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh. A small place, the kind that's been in the same spot for 35 years and still uses the same laminated menus. Nolan ordered a burger and fries and ate like he hadn't had a real meal in longer than he wanted to say. I had coffee and pie and watched him eat and didn't make a big deal out of it. When he was done, he leaned back and looked at me across the table. "What happens now?" he asked. "Tomorrow I make some calls." I said, "Tonight you sleep in a warm house." He nodded slowly. "Clifford's going to make this hard." "Clifford doesn't have as much leverage as he thinks he does," I said, "and I've got more patience than he's counting on." That was true. I'd spent 30 years in construction, dealing with inspectors and contractors and weather and timelines that never went the way you planned. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to document everything and wait for the right moment. Clifford was used to running a household where he made the rules and everyone else adjusted. He wasn't prepared for someone who didn't need to win the argument in the room. We got home around 9 that night. I showed Nolan to the guest room, the same one he'd used every summer when he was a kid. Norma had kept a quilt on that bed that she'd made herself, blue and white squares, and it was still there. He ran his hand over it when he walked in and didn't say anything. But I saw it. I told him there were extra blankets in the closet, and that breakfast would be ready by 8. He said goodnight and closed the door, and I stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the quiet of the house, which felt different now than it had that morning. The next day I started making calls. First was a family attorney I'd used years ago for Norma's estate. I explained the situation and asked what grandparent visitation rights looked like in Pennsylvania. He told me that under Pennsylvania law, specifically 23 Pass, CS. Section 53205 grandparents can petition for visitation rights when the relationship with the grandchild has been intentionally interrupted and when visitation is in the child's best interest. Given that we had documented evidence of harm, a CPS case already open, and a 16-year-old who could speak for himself in front of a judge, he said we were in a strong position to file. I told him to get the paperwork started. Second call was to the CPS caseworker who had been assigned to Nolan's case. Her name was Patricia, and she was straightforward and professional. I gave her everything I had, the photos from Thanksgiving with timestamps, screenshots of Nolan's message through the school app, Bo Whitfield's written account of seeing Nolan outside at 11:30, 1h, and 2:30. And then I went through the pattern, date by date, incident by incident, everything Nolan had told me in the truck, the February garage night. The 6 weeks of eating alone, the rules about speaking at the table, the bruise in July. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she told me a home visit with Carol and Clifford would be scheduled within the week. She also told me that the information I'd provided about the ongoing pattern would be included in the assessment, not just the Thanksgiving incident. I thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes with my coffee. I thought about Carol. I had been turning it over in my head since the drive home, trying to figure out when exactly things had gone wrong and whether I had missed something I should have caught. The honest answer was yes. There were signs I had explained away because I didn't want to believe what they were pointing at. The shortened calls. The way Nolan had gone quiet at Christmas dinner 2 years ago, barely speaking, eyes on his plate, and I had told myself he was just being a teenager. The time Carol had canceled a visit at the last minute, and I had let it go because I didn't want to push and make things worse. I had been trying to keep the peace, and the peace had cost my grandson 3 years. Norma would have seen it sooner. She had a way of looking past the surface of things that I never quite matched. She'd said something to me once about a year before she got sick, that she was worried about Nolan, that he seemed smaller every time they talked on the phone. I had told her she was reading too much into it. She hadn't argued with me, but she hadn't agreed either. She just looked at me with that expression she had, the patient one, the one that meant she was going to let me figure it out on my own. I figured it out, later than I should have. Nolan came downstairs around 8:15 that morning and found me at the stove. I made eggs and toast and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about school. He was a junior, doing well in math and physics, had a teacher who he said actually made calculus make sense. He talked about it with his hands moving, explaining something about derivatives, and I watched his face and thought about how different he looked from the boy sitting on those steps the day before. That was the version of him that had been there all along, underneath everything Clifford had been pressing down on him for 3 years. The CPS home visit happened the following Tuesday. Patricia called me afterward and told me what she could. The assessment had identified several areas of concern. Carol and Clifford were both required to attend family counseling. Court-ordered, not optional, a follow-up visit would be scheduled in 30 days. Clifford had been given a second formal warning, and Patricia made clear that the next incident would move past warnings into something more serious. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, my attorney filed the petition for grandparent visitation rights. The hearing was scheduled for late January. Nolan was asked to speak with a family court evaluator, which he did on his own without me in the room. He told me afterward that he had said everything, all of it. The evaluator had listened for almost an hour without interrupting him. The judge issued the visitation order on a Thursday afternoon. Schedules, protected time, every other weekend and 1 weekday evening per week. No one could cancel it without going back to court. No one could use it as a bargaining chip or a reward for good behavior or a punishment for something Nolan said or did. It was his and it was mine, and it was written into a legal document that Clifford Tate had no power over. I drove to pick Nolan up for the first scheduled visit on a Saturday morning in February. Snow on the ground, bright, cold sun. Carol answered the door. Clifford was not visible. She and I stood on the porch for a moment, and I could see that something had shifted in her. She looked tired in a way that wasn't just from lack of sleep. The counseling was doing something, I think, pulling things up that she had worked hard to keep buried. She said, "I know I don't have any right to ask you for anything right now." I said, "That's probably true." She looked at her hands. "I just want you to know that I'm trying to understand how I let this happen. I don't have a good answer yet, but I'm trying to find one." I thought about what to say for a second. "That's a start," I told her. "Keep going." Nolan came out with his jacket half-zipped and his backpack over one shoulder, the same way he'd walked out of every door since he was about 12 years old. He said bye to his mother without much warmth but without coldness either. Just a word. A door left slightly open. We drove out to the lake. The ice was still solid enough that we could walk the edge of it, and we did that for a while before we found a good spot and set up. Nolan had gotten better at this over the years. He didn't need me to tell him anything about the line or the weight or the patience required. He just knew it. We sat out there for about 3 hours, caught a few small ones, and threw them back. Talked about school, about the engineering programs he was starting to look at for college, about a friend named Perry who was teaching him guitar. He said he'd been sleeping better since Thanksgiving, said the house was quieter than he expected, but that the quiet felt different here than it had at Clifford's place. There it had felt like something waiting to go wrong. Here, it just felt like quiet. I told him Norma used to say that a house tells you how it feels about you, that some houses are just holding their breath and some houses are actually resting. He laughed a little and said that sounded like something she would say. It did. It sounded exactly like her. On the drive home, he fell asleep in the passenger seat about 20 minutes out, the way he used to do when he was small and we'd been out all day. I turned the radio down and drove and thought about the last few months. The 3 words on a Wednesday night, the blue lips on the front steps, the photos and the timestamps and the calls and the paperwork and the slow, unglamorous work of making things right through the proper channels. Nobody threw a punch. Nobody made a dramatic speech in a courtroom. I just showed up, documented what I saw, made the calls I needed to make, and refused to go away quietly. That's the whole story. There's a version of me that on Thanksgiving Day walks up to that door and starts yelling. That version of me probably gets escorted off the property and loses any legal standing he might have had. The version of me that sat in the truck and dialed 911 got his grandson back. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is stay calm, stay organized, and let the system work the way it's supposed to when you give it what it needs. Nolan is still with me most weekends. He's talking about mechanical engineering at Penn State. He's going to be fine, better than fine. If this story means something to you, pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There are more stories like this one, and I think you'll want to hear them.